Hello and welcome, and in today's video I'm going to be discussing the Holocaust in Lithuania. Now, I've already done a number of videos on the Holocaust in Lithuania, so this could be seen, I think, as an introduction to things which I did many months ago, but that's the way it is. I thought I should really do an overview of what actually happened. I've already discussed a number of massacres and perpetrators, and I've done biographies of perpetrators. Some links will be at the end of this video and in the description. Lithuania became independent as a result of the First World War. Like many countries, it became independent then. It became an autocracy with a fascist style of government. Before 1939, 150 to 155,000 Jews approximately lived in Lithuania. After the area of Vilnius was very generously donated to Lithuania by Stalin, another 80,000 formerly Polish Jews became Lithuanians. And so that meant to say there were around 230 to 235,000 Jews in the borders of what was then Lithuania. Now, the survival rate was possibly no more than around 10,000, and the number one cause for survival was because the survivors had been arrested by the NKVD, and they had been transported to the gulags, and they had survived the gulags. Lithuanian nationalists defined their identity, as many do, through language and culture, and as far as that was concerned, Jews would have seemed as outsiders. They didn't speak Lithuanian as a rule. The main language, of course, was Yiddish. Polish was obviously very common. Indeed, in Kaunas, shortly after Lithuania became independent, my understanding is that Lithuania was hardly even used in the capital. It was mainly Polish and Russian. And there's lots of people also obviously spoke Russian. Russia had occupied the country for many years, and it was to do so again. The political conditions that existed in Lithuania just before the Holocaust caused severe shocks in society, and it was widely believed by many that Jews were privileged under the Soviet administration. The fact that there were probably more Jews deported than any other group is a way in which this privilege demonstrated itself. There was anti-Semitism. It escalated as a result. You've got to bear in mind also these hundreds of years of anti-Semitism coming from the church authorities, and that clearly is going to ingrain, particularly from the Russian Orthodox Church, this is going to ingrain this feelings, which were then to lead to the Holocaust. And anyway, to put this into some more context, in August 1939, Molotov and Ribbentrop met each other. Lithuania was part of their deal in carving up the Eastern Europe or Central Europe, and Lithuania was to be given to Nazi Germany. Stalin got in contact with Hitler towards the end of September 1939 and said, "I'll tell you what, we'd like to have Lithuania. In exchange, you can have a bit of Poland, which you had originally agreed to give us." Hitler was overjoyed, so the land between the Vistula and the Bug was thus granted to Nazi Germany, and in exchange, Stalin got Lithuania. However, he didn't invade Lithuania immediately. In fact, his first act was to give part of Poland, which had been assigned to him, to Lithuania. That's the area around Vilnius. That's why 80,000 Polish Jews thus became Lithuanian Jews. And however, Stalin did invade and or give a ultimatum which had to be obeyed, and thus Lithuania became occupied by the Soviet Union. It was a brutal occupation, as it was everywhere, with massive deportations, and indeed in the 8 days or so before the invasion, so from the 14th of June 1941, at least 20,000 Lithuanians were sent to the Gulag, and this is the worst of the deportation. It may have even been more, maybe as many as 35,000 people. I mean, the records are just not clear. But in any case, what Soviet occupation meant was the theft of private property. It was increased poverty because of what they did to destroying the economic infrastructure, and the standards of living, which of course declined for everyone. But above all, they declined for people who were unable to produce their own food. And so people living in cities, and so it's quite surprising that actually in some ways that the people who benefited the most from the Soviet occupation were those that then blamed the Jews for the Soviet occupation. If you could produce food in a communist country, then usually you were okay. So small farmers, as long as their land remained private and it wasn't nationalized, stolen I should say, then they could be okay. On the 22nd of June 1941, Operation Barbarossa began, and many Lithuanians initially welcomed the Germans as liberators from Soviet rule. There were revolts behind the Soviet lines. There were people who had been resistors from the beginning of the Soviet occupation the previous year. So there was some type of organization in place. Places such as parts of Kaunas were liberated, if that's the right word, by Lithuanian resistance, and these characters who became known as partisans, sometimes operating with the Germans, but other times not at all, were able to actually facilitate the advance of the Wehrmacht. Now, in times like this, of course, you get a breakdown of law and order, and so many of those who later participated in the Holocaust were called partisans. And now these groups which had been opposed to Soviet rule, some of them may have been genuine partisans, but others, and this is what I suspect, were people who just jumped onto the bandwagon, because when you've got a breakdown of law and order, you've got guns and the other people haven't, that's a great opportunity to steal. And at the same time, you can also murder the people you're stealing from. And there was this phase of killings. Now, how many people were actually murdered in this initial phase is not clear. But I think it's probably between 4,000 and 10,000 people. I think it's fair to say, though, it's certainly 4,000 in pogroms. And some of these places where these pogroms actually took place were documented by German soldiers. For example, in Kaunas, there was a garage killings which took place. Some 100 people are killed there by some character with an iron crowbar, was murdering some Jewish people who had been rounded up, and then he apparently, according to the eyewitness testimony, he sat on a pile of bodies and played the Lithuanian national anthem. However, other places, the same things actually occurred. They even occurred in former Polish areas in Vilna area as well. Franz von Rox, commander of Rear Army Area North, he reported mass shootings in Kaunas to his superior Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, and von Leeb advised restraint. Rox himself suggested sterilizing all male Jews as a safer solution. Now, even before the invasion, the German leadership had drafted plans for civilian administration under Reich Commissariat Ostland, which was commanded by Heinrich Lohse. Rural areas were to be cleansed to use their word. I don't like using that word, but that's, I find myself finding a difficult word, other word to use. They were to be cleansed of Jews. Walter Stahlecker, I've done several videos on in some depth, head of Einsatzgruppe A, objected on the 6th of August 1941, and he saw a golden opportunity, as he would have seen it, suddenly present of itself, and he urged, and now I quote, a almost 100% immediate cleansing of the entire Ostland. This would not just lead to the prevention of Jewish reproduction and ghettoization as per preparation for future mass deportations or murders, because it would seem that whereas Hitler and others had claimed that the whole rotten edifice of the Soviet Union would come down, that this campaign was going to last 6 weeks or 8 weeks or against the entire Soviet Union, it would seem that others, though, didn't believe it was going to happen this quick, and they were surprised at the speed at which Lithuania was captured. On the 15th to 16th of August 1941, SS Obersturmführer Joachim Hamann, head of a Rollkommando, murdered 3,200 Jews, including women and children. Heinrich Himmler likely issued orders for mass extermination by the end of July. So the German civilian authorities not only condoned the killings, but often initiated them, particularly in the first half of August 1941. So Jews were placed in around 100 ghettos and camps, rural ghettos often being just a synagogue or maybe a barn or some other building where there's obviously next to no conditions for people to live in. Okay, maybe it was a shelter, but that was about it. This, of course, when people are pushed into areas, they have the property stolen from them, there's a mass of people in one place, because of their lack of food, they're ill. What happens? They're diseases, the body doesn't have the same resistance, and as they become they have these diseases, then this is an excuse, and this is an excuse for mass murder by the Hamann's Rollkommando or other units. Now, the number one place, however, where people were murdered was in the 9th Fort in Kaunas. You can visit it today. It's a museum in that city. And another place is in the forest, the Ponary forest, which is south of Vilnius, in the part of Lithuania which had previously been Poland. By the end of 1941, the extinction of Lithuanian Jews was well underway. Indeed, the majority of the Jews were now dead. SS leader Karl Jäger meticulously documented these killings in what became known as the Jäger Report, listing daily murders, locations and numbers up to the 1st of December 1941. And Jäger reported that 137,346 Jews had been murdered. And this excludes further killings by Einsatzkommando 2 in northwestern Lithuania. And according to the Wannsee Conference minutes of the 20th of January 1942, there was at this time only 34,000 Jews living in Lithuania. So the attacks on the Jewish population began on the 22nd of June, and this in Vilnius, in Kaunas, in Šiauliai, in Panevėžys. In the Kaunas pogrom of the 23rd to 25th, or Kaunas pogroms, 23rd, 25th of June 1941, there some 1,500 Jews were murdered, 60 houses were burned, 2,300 more killed in the following days. In the 24th of June, a Lithuanian Saugumo police, which was a sort of a Lithuanian Gestapo, if you like, was established to assist the Nazis. And in late June alone, so you'd had mass killings in towns Altius, Ukmergė, Jonava, Rokiškis and Kėdainiai. and with the victims often being sort of taken out, shot in forest or pits or whatever they could find. Ponary, for example, which is a forest, but the forest had been prepared by the Red Army for fuel storage, which hadn't been finished like everything else that the Soviet Union didn't try to do, and so the people were killed. These pits were already there, so they were used. July 1941, you've even got the civilian authorities and the Wehrmacht assisting with the coordination of killings, Kaunas, Vilnius, Shulai, and other places. And so you can see that this is something that happened really, really quickly. Lithuania, in some ways, became the testing ground. Because people in Poland itself, part of Poland that was occupied by Nazi Germany, Holocaust was really 1942, the most bloody month being August of 1942. Well, by that time, in Lithuania, there was hardly very few Jews who were actually left. So, beginning of 42, you've got surviving Jews forced into slave labour for largely for the Nazi war economy. You've got 43,000, for example, in the what's called the concentration camp, the Kaunas concentration camp, and also in the Vilna in Shulai ghettos. There were some smaller rural camps as well. The numbers, therefore, given the Wannsee Conference, are possibly slightly lower than they should have been. These people were largely murdered by shooting from around April of 1943 onwards. By July 1944, when the Red Army reoccupied Lithuania, there were scarcely any Jews left. Now, the biggest one single site, of course, being the 9th Fort in Kaunas, as well as the Ponary Forest. Now, it needs to be pointed out that many Lithuanians, and understandably, saw German troops as liberators from the Soviets. And so what the Soviets did in this period of just under 1 year during their occupation of Lithuania, and that was what people initially saw. After a while, it must have been pretty clear that the Nazis were even worse than the Soviets. There was a provisional Lithuanian government which was set up, but that was dissolved on the 5th of August 1941 because the Nazis certainly didn't want these locals setting up their own governments. Stahlecker himself noted that pogroms above all in Kaunas, it was initially difficult to organise, but they were eventually carried out with these so-called partisans. And as well as Saugumo and Sonderkommando Ypatrinis Boris and the Lithuanian Workers' Guard actively participated. Fascist Iron Wolf organisation also provided local supporters. Nonetheless, it must be pointed out that there were many locals who attempted to hide Jews despite the risks to themselves. And my opinion is that you've got all of these hundreds of years of this propaganda coming from above all the Russian Orthodox Church to do with this hate towards Jews. Jews were then seen, because these conspiracy theories which were put out, that some of the Jews were communists, despite the fact that Jews were probably the largest single ethnic group which was persecuted by the communists in Lithuania in the period of the occupation, and then blaming the Jews for the communist occupation itself. So I think that these are the things. And it's often said about people who didn't help, but it takes a huge amount of courage to do something like this. And whereas very few people had guns, and all of the people who had guns were the were the killers, and so people, they had nothing really to actually defend themselves with. Now, after the war, there were trials, and the very first one actually occurred was in 1950. Martin Weiss and August Herrings got life imprisonment for the roles that they played in the Ponary murders, and I am just about to do, I will have done by the time this gets published, I've done a video on Martin Weiss and what happened to him after the war. In 1958 there was the Einsatzgruppen trial, which tried people from the Tilsit commando, and this led to 10 perpetrators being sentenced. Hans Joachim Böhmer received 15 years for 3,907 murders, amongst others. And in April 1961 in Aurich, Werner Schei and Karl Struve, SS leaders responsible for other massacres, they initially got quite lenient sentences. Again, on the case of Werner Schei, I've done a video, about to do a video on him. And in September 1961 you had Gestapo members Alfred Krumbach, Wilhelm Gerke, Hermann Ernst Jahr were put on trial. Krumbach got only 4 years for murdering 827 people. In the Soviet Union, the Black Book documented crimes and local complicity. Abraham Sutzkever collected detailed reports, but the publication was actually suppressed until 1994, and this was because of the Soviet political considerations. Now, this was quite difficult, of course, for the Soviet Union to actually do, because it was embarrassing for them. First of all, the Soviet Union was responsible for starting the Second World War alongside Nazi Germany. Of course, they denied it and continue to deny it in Russia today, but the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was the beginning of the Second World War, how the Second World War started, and without the Soviet interference, or without Soviet assistance in the attack on Poland, then the Holocaust certainly wouldn't have been possible. It wouldn't have happened. And so that was number one, but also the fact that these crimes were committed by people who'd been in the resistance, alleged to have been in the resistance against the communists. I think Lithuania is undoubtedly the first phase of the final solution as such. Local perpetrators, you've got Auxiliaries, you've got Rollkommando, Hamann, carrying out these killings, which are documented so well in the Jäger report. The Jäger report is very, very detailed. Since its independence in 1990, Lithuania's initiated national discussion. There's memorials, there's education initiatives, there's a Jewish museum in Vilnius, there's a museum of occupations and freedom struggles, there's these stumbling blocks, these are plaques in the ground. I've got 1 or 2 videos of them, and I've seen them around in Germany, for example. And President Algirdas Brazaukas issued an official apology in 1995 for those Lithuanians who assisted in the Holocaust, and there are educational programs like the House of Remembrance which continue Holocaust education today. I would have to say that, for example, in last summer when I was actually filming these locations, the locations are very well marked, how to get to them, and the locations are preserved, and there is a lot of information. So from that point of view, I think Lithuania has done a good job. So anyway, there's an overview. I have done very detailed videos on just about every person I've mentioned in this video. Should you want to know more, I've got so I'll give you some links. You can also see the places where these murders took place, because I've actually videoed them, and I've showed the places such as Mariampole, Wilkowiczkis, Kalvaria, and my plan is also to go to Lithuania next summer as well. Now I had a slight problem, whereas I know the other languages I've mentioned here. I don't speak Lithuanian, so if I've said any names incorrectly, you know the reason for it. I can't even understand it. It's not like sometimes, there's certain languages which you can sort of get by in. I mean, last week I was in a shop and there was a couple of women from Slovakia, and I was able to talk to them quite freely, speaking Polish to them, and then they spoke back to me in Slovakian. And only a couple of days ago I told some Czech tourists how to get to Piccadilly Circus by speaking to them in Polish, and they were speaking back to me in Czech. So it's not and sometimes so these languages are sufficiently close at times to be able to understand. So the Yiddish, I confuse Yiddish and German. I put a lot of Yiddish words into German, and somebody said to me when I was trying to speak Yiddish, I said that's just German. So sometimes the languages are relatively close together, but in the case of Lithuanian, I can't speak it at all. Indeed, I was in Lidl in Vilkaviškis, and there was a problem with the bread I'd bought, in priced incorrectly, and I even had to ask them if they spoke Russian, which is because I'm trying not to speak Russian now, because I got a bit cheesed off after what I saw in Lithuania and in Ukraine. Anyway, that apart. So thanks very much for watching. I hope you found that interesting. Lots of other videos I've done on this subject, but for the moment, from me in the United Kingdom, all the best, and I hope you'll be interested in finding more information about this subject. Bye for now.